Thanks, Rebecca. The next session is a panel discussion on advancing pediatric innovation through digital health initiatives. And may I request our panelists to come onto the stage. Vasum Paris, Robert Menino, Sally Kuzaruga, and Eric Zugalski. Please have a seat. Let me do brief introductions. And the format is going to be, we'll have our panelists talk for 5 minutes each. I'll give you a 1-minute warning or 30-second warning, whatever you want. Please try to keep it to under 5 minutes. And then we'll have some Q&As, including questions from the audience. Let me introduce my panelists, starting from my right. Sally Kuzaruga is an innovation leader at Children's Mercy Hospital with over 16 years of experience combining business intelligence with human understanding to drive meaningful consumer engagement and revenue growth. Robert Menino is a postdoctoral fellow at Medical Microsystems and Hematology Lab, the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech and Emory University, and also the Chief Technology Officer of Sanguina. Eric Zugalski is the President and CEO of Archimedic, and in that role, he focuses on organizational development, new business development, and strategic initiatives. He also works closely with companies to define the product development strategies that will achieve their long-term objectives. And finally, Vasum Paris is the Chief Medical Officer, Pediatrics and Special Populations in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health under the FDA. Welcome again. And I'll start with Sally, if you can talk about your thoughts on advancing pediatric innovation through digital health, and how is that happening at Children's Mercy?
That sounds great. I think I have a clicker over here. Thank you. Yep. I'm going to go back. Okay, before I start this video, I just wanted to have you all think, as you hear this, these stories come through, just the needs that are rooted in the different solutions that are coming to life at Children's Mercy.
Their goal is to get home. It's such a reward to be able to use technology that enables that to happen.
We're enabling better outcomes by making clinical practice guidelines easily accessible to medical providers across the country.
It was very easy to just click and get directions. This is something that's very helpful when you feel like you don't have a handle on what's going on.
We're motivating and empowering teens to take a more active role in their healthcare.
Very important to get the dose just right. What we've done is developed a tool that allows the point of care clinician to do that exactly at the time it's needed and make care as efficient as possible.
So at Children's Mercy, we're working how to bring different app development to our patients and families, as well as community providers, so that they can learn more about pediatric care, especially for providers who don't see pediatric patients frequently. We're also integrating digital health into the clinical flow. And that's been essential to help all the digital information come in to drive different decision making and enhance our care plan, in addition to care planning and surgical planning. And then finally, we're really building out a whole infrastructure around telehealth and how do we help the direct-to-consumer access patient care more readily, as well as integrating it into our population health subsidiary. And with that, a big portion of the foundation that we do going forward is really about understanding the patient and family needs. So we have, at the very beginning of any digital project, a very deep dive into specific patients and families, working with the Teen Advisory Board, Family and Patient Advisory Boards, to really inform what are the requirements going into a solution. We also work very closely with our clinical team to make sure that anything that we develop, although may be accurate from a scientific standpoint is very practical and helps them drive decision making at the point of care. Our Innovation Center at Children's Mercy was charged with developing a digital strategy across the enterprise. And with that, as Dr. Kraft challenged us this morning, was really about what's our future state? Where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years as we bring that to life? And a big component of that is really getting to that predictive, personalized, participatory, and preventative medicine. But with that, it's very exciting to think about the possibilities, but it can also be very daunting to think about how do you go from where you are today and how do you get to that future state. And really the big foundational pieces of that are, again, rooted in the needs of your patients, families, clinicians, and researchers, really understanding what capabilities are available today to make steps towards that, and what are the trends in the marketplace that can bring that to life in new ways, especially as consumerism is coming into healthcare. One of the big practical components of this, working in an institution that has research as well as clinical care and wanting to meet the needs of our patients and families, is really understanding the idea that each of these groups have different definitions of value. They're all going to a form of improved outcomes, but with that becomes a challenge of how do you design an integrated digital strategy that meets the diverse needs of that value. One example of this is just data. Our researchers are looking for dense, raw data to be able to drive their insights. However, clinicians are looking for data that would be tied to quick clinical care, integrated into the EMR that drives their decisions. And patients and families want seamless data. They don't even want to think about it at all. They want it to just be informed into their care plan without interrupting their flow of life. And so as we brought to life this digital strategy, we really wanted to think through how do we standardize across these audiences, but really take into account repeatable processes, the idea that we could resource share both the investment as well as the insights, and really create a collaborative knowledge environment across these audiences. So really overall, as we look at our digital health strategy, it's about meeting those unmet needs and defining them to map out which ones we want to get to, leveraging technology in a new way to meet these needs, starting with that future back vision, and then ultimately delivering value across those audiences.
Thank you. Thanks, Hallie. We'll move on to We'll do questions at the end. We'll move on to Robert.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Menino. I'm a postdoc in Dr. Wilbur Lamb's lab at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Emory University, and Georgia Tech, and the Chief Technology Officer of Sanguina, which is the startup company that's going to be commercializing the technology I'm going to speak about today. And so that'll be my disclosure. Anemia is the world's most common blood disorder. It's defined by low blood hemoglobin levels, and it's caused by either the decreased production or the increased destruction of red blood cells. If left untreated, anemia can lead to fatigue, weakness, and life-threatening cardiovascular events in severe circumstances. But when anemia is discovered, very simple interventions can have profound impacts on patients' quality of life. But the gold standard screening method for anemia is expensive, invasive, and time-consuming. The gold standard test is the complete blood count, or the CBC, which requires a patient get themselves to a clinic where a venous blood draw is administered, which we all know causes pain and discomfort, especially in our pediatric patients. And the sample is analyzed on an expensive piece of equipment called a clinical hematology analyzer, which requires yet another trained technician to operate and consumes expensive reagents. And I know firsthand about the challenges and time that this takes. As you may have noticed in the picture, that's me. So I have a blood condition called beta thalassemia major that causes me to be severely anemic to the point that I require monthly blood transfusions as treatment. And my experience living with this disease is what motivated me to solve this issue. And to that end, I developed a non-invasive smartphone app for measuring hemoglobin. So this app, which is compatible with multiple makes and models of smartphones on both Android and iOS operating systems, allows a user to take an image of their fingernails on their smartphone, and then our custom image analysis algorithm will analyze the color of the fingernails, and display an accurate hemoglobin level result directly to them, as you can see in this video. In our recent publication in Nature Communications, we showed that the system is able to accurately measure hemoglobin levels to within plus or minus 2.4 grams per deciliter, and is agnostic to skin tone and background lighting conditions. You can see in the plot on the left where the smartphone hemoglobin level is plotted against the gold standard CBC. You can see a strong correlation with an average error of less than 1 gram per deciliter. And in the plot next to it, the Bland-Altman shows the 95% limits of agreement that I mentioned before with a very minimal bias. Now in the graphs on the right, when error is plotted against a linear value for the skin tone and the background lighting condition measured with a digital light meter, you can see no correlation, and that's because the fingernails and the nail beds don't contain skin pigment producing cells, and the primary pigment contributor comes from the hemoglobin in the blood in the vessels within the nail bed. And each image is taken using the camera flash, which overpowers and normalizes for background lighting conditions. Now, other point-of-care diagnostics exist in this space to solve this problem, but they all offer trade-offs between cost, convenience, and accuracy. You can see some examples of some invasive tests and a very expensive non-invasive test, but none of them are really able to optimize cost, accuracy, and invasiveness, and none of them are for use outside of a clinical setting, like this app that I've developed is. So as of right now, we've licensed the underlying technology and intellectual property to Sanguina from the university, where we're improving and validating the user interface with the goal of launching initially as a tool to encourage users to maintain a healthy lifestyle by providing access to a new biomarker about their health that wasn't previously available to them. Going forward, we're looking to apply personalized medicine to this approach. You can see some preliminary data we've shown by tracking 4 individual patients, 2 with chronic anemia, one of those being myself, and 2 without, where we tracked them over about a month and trained an algorithm for measuring hemoglobin specific to those people. And then we tested it in a subsequent month, and the data is shown on the screen, where you can see that the accuracy actually doubled over the general population studies we did before. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in the Lamb Lab and at Sanguina, and thank our funding sources. And I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. That's truly innovative, using a person's story to find a solution which is a better standard of care, which can help a lot more patients. Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Sagowski. Actually, I think this is the wrong set of slides. Do you want to go next? Sure.
All right.
No worries.
Switch up
Hi,
players.
everybody. This has been a great deal of fun. I want to congratulate the organizers. You've put on a fantastic conference that really has provided some exceptional insights, and it's wonderful to see this entire space and everyone that's coming together to try to figure out how do we make these systems and these great advances in technology truly make a difference for the pediatric community, because that's something that really is important and one of the areas that obviously I work on regularly. That is not exactly what I'm going to be speaking on today. I was asked to talk a little bit about our digital health program, so I'll try to take you quickly through that. It'll be fast, so don't worry, I'll be around if you have any questions afterwards. See if I can make this work. So really quickly, what I want to go over with you is the need for a tailored approach with respect to the regulatory space. What is software as a medical device, and where does AI and machine learning fit in? And the fundamentals of our proposed framework right now, which we definitely encourage feedback on. So the basic need here, right? What you see here is the fact that we do a great deal of work at the FDA. In case anybody was wondering, we obviously regulate all the medical products that everybody gets to use, but we recognize that that work's going to exponentially increase, especially with the advent of AI and ML. And we need to make sure that we have a regulatory process in place that will help to ensure that we are not stifling innovation, that we're supporting innovation, and that we continue to make sure that devices that make a difference with respect to patient care are safe and effective. That's our fundamental process that we deal with every single day. Where's a crossover between AI and FDA? Basically, it's really simply put in three areas with my complex graph that I've put out here. It is basically in AI used to develop and study FDA-regulated products, AI that's actually in FDA-regulated products, and basically AI to oversee FDA-regulated products. Easy, simple, right? So what are our goals for this regulatory framework? We want to make sure that we're enhancing patient access to high-quality digital medical products, that we enable manufacturers to rapidly innovate and improve on software and develop minor changes, that we maintain that reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and fundamentally that this is not a burdensome process for anybody, and that we are creating a system that truly does work for everyone. What is software as a medical device and AI really fit together? Basically, very simply put, software as a medical device is defined both by us and the International Medical Device Regulators Forum as a software that specifically works outside of hardware in terms of all the other devices that we regulate. And with respect to this little algorithm or this graph that I have up here, AI fits in that middle section, right? You have inputs into a software, you have some type of algorithm that processes those inputs, and then you have an output. AI brings in a new perspective with respect to this, right? Because AI can actually begin to learn and make decisions and potentially put out outputs that could influence medical decisions for patients in a way that we haven't really set up a regulatory framework in the past to help ensure that these devices continue to be safe and effective. And I thank everyone else that has done all the prior work to clarify what that entire space is, right? I'm glad that I don't have to necessarily go over with you what deep learning is and what all that will do. Thank you, Anthony, for the talks yesterday. Very simply put, the spectrum here in terms of the devices that we regulate are along this line. And there are those that have that locked algorithm, right? Data goes in, processed, output. There's a locked algorithm. We know what the general inputs are. We know what the outputs are. And there's iterative changes to that process. Moving over all the way to the other side, there's a potential for continuously adaptive algorithms. Those algorithms are changing, learning, and potentially can influence medical care without us fully having a chance to review them. And that's the system that we need to set up appropriately. Very quickly, this quick overview here, I know I'm running out of time. We want to make sure that we understand the full medical life cycle of AI. Very quickly put, you have a training model, then you have a model for validation with the data that's initially input into a software package. And then when that device is deployed out into the real world with respect to real use in medicine, you have that deployed model that is developing new insights from the new live information that's being produced. And that model monitoring could be then fed back to that model, the training model. And so what we want to do is to overlay that system with respect to our entire total product lifecycle approach. And part of that is ensuring that the companies and the developers and innovators in this space are actually have good quality systems management, and that we have a method by which to evaluate the real-world evidence that's being utilized. And this also brings up a key point that was talked about yesterday about labeling data sets, right? We want to make sure that the data sets that are actually being utilized are labeled appropriately. Because once a AI device with deep learning is out in the real world, it can learn from almost anywhere. And that is the key point here. We need to ensure that the information that it's learning from is actually accurate. So I think that was very helpful that that point was brought out yesterday. Very quickly put, part of our framework is to go through with device manufacturers to help them help us recognize that there is a standardized approach in terms of how they will change their software, that there is transparency with respect to their reporting of those changes, and that's what this slide really is intended to give you. And then just going to take this one step further very quickly on the clinical side, not just the clinical validation of the software itself, but on the clinical side, does the software make the right determinations to help improve care for patients? And that clinical aspect is really kind of cut out into three different areas that we're working on. And that's to ensure that that there's valid clinical associations. That means, does the output of the product actually make the right determinations and target the right clinical condition. Then we go to the analytical validation, and that basically means that is the evidence that is being generated in the inputs to the product, does that create a precise and accurate data output according to the algorithm? And then the clinical validation with respect to that output, is it actually targeting the right populations and making the right determinations for the population that it's intended to treat? The open questions that still exist are really around that spectrum that I mentioned. We're going from the current hardware and devices that we have, where humans are modifying the devices. We have the next step is the software as a medical device, where there's fixed algorithms, as I mentioned, and then the deep learning is technology is modifying this. And the key questions that we're trying to work through with respect to this regulatory framework and developing is, how do we appropriately ensure that these areas are being answered, that we're continuing to ensure safety and effectiveness for all the devices that are being that we're approving, while continuing again to ensure that innovation is being supported and that technologies like this are able to make a positive, accurate difference in the care that's being provided, because there's obviously so much potential here, and we just want to ensure that the process we're putting together really is something that is modern and works for the health and well-being of the U.S. public. Very quickly, there's a discussion paper that we've put out that really goes over this in a little bit more detail. Happy to get feedback on any of that information, and these are some sites that you can visit to help provide some of that feedback. Quick overview, happy to take questions later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vasu. Most of us generally think of regulatory agencies as slow and cumbersome. It's really good to see that FDA has a specific process for regulating newer technologies. And it's nice to have a pediatrician as an N in FDA. It always helps. Eric?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Sigalski. I'm the CEO of a company called Archimedic. We are fortunate to be working with a number of the children's hospitals that are represented here today. Our focus is on medical device development, and today I'm going to speak with you about remote monitoring systems, also referred to as RPM devices. So first question, why remote monitoring devices, RPM systems for pediatrics? Why are they really important? Catching issues early is one of the primary reasons, especially for nonverbal patient populations. It allows for home-based recovery, which in many cases has proven to improve outcomes, reduce costs, improve the overall experience for patients and parents. And lastly, provides peace of mind for the patients, the parents, and the care teams that are responsible for the health of these children. RPM can be used across the full continuum of care, from diagnosis through progression to therapy to stability. A couple of examples here. In the diagnosis stage, there are researchers at Purdue that are using RPM devices to detect autism during the first year of life. Markers for autism at this stage are not well characterized, and so this work is very important. On the progression side, so Medtronic has developed a system for emergency departments that are looking to understand the vulnerability of patients that are waiting. So every patient that comes in receives this small wearable. This is providing a dashboard to the care team that's looking at all of these patients and figuring out which ones have symptoms that are progressing and might need to be advanced through into the emergency department. On the therapy side, this is a particularly important space for pediatrics. Because we're dealing with small patient populations, many of the therapies, the drugs, the surgeries that are taking place, they are not well characterized. The outcomes or the side effects of these studies are not well characterized, and RPM devices have the opportunity of being able to provide some feedback to clinical care teams to adjust the medication protocols or intervene as necessary. So this is an example of a company called Luco. It's a spin-out from MIT that's developing an RPM device to quantify white blood cell count for patients undergoing chemotherapy. And lastly, on the stability side, Boston Scientific and other cardiovascular implant companies are integrating RPM technology to provide status updates of not only the device, the implant, but also the health of the patient. So there are some big opportunities for RPM devices, but there are also some significant challenges facing RPM systems. Human factors is one of the big ones. So for most of these products, you need to get very strong and constant skin contact. So how are you doing this without creating skin irritation, constriction that ultimately leads to non-compliance? Data reliability. So everyone is familiar with the false positives that often occur with RPM devices. So how do we build devices that provide a reliable indicator, but also don't trigger false positives or false negatives? And then lastly, data accessibility. How do we integrate the output of these RPM devices into the electronic health records? How do we prevent data overload from the physicians? And how do we integrate into the busy workflow of clinicians? A quick overview on the development process for novel RPM devices. Typically, this first phase is skipped over and hustled into the following phases, but we find that developing a really strong development plan that looks at not just technical factors, but also regulatory factors, reimbursement, the marketing side, manufacturing, this lays the roadmap and really paves the path for the rest of the development process. On the concept development side, for RPM devices, this is where we're looking at reliability of the sensors. Are we getting the data that's showing the accuracy, the precision of these devices? We're also looking at the human factors aspects. Is this the right configuration? Does it provide the right use case for long-term use? On the development side, this is where the production engineering data is coming together, where a lot of iterative prototyping is taking place. This is also where the quality management documentation, the risk management documentation is being put together to ensure that we're developing a safe and effective medical device. Verification and validation side, this is where all of the testing is taking place for not only hardware verification, but also looking at things like sterilization, biocompatibility, human factors. Ultimately, this is when clinicals are taking place and also when the regulatory filings are completed. And then lastly, on the commercialization side, this is when devices are transferred over to a manufacturing team. This is where process validation often takes place. Pilot builds are completed and often comparative studies to measure an RPM device against the standard of care. When we think about device development, we're often looking at it as a series of risks, all of these risks being lined up on the left-hand side from IP to technology to clinical efficacy, regulatory. And the job of a product development team is to really try to chip away at each of these risks. And in doing so, there's an inverse relationship between the risks that are reduced and the value that's created. This value represents the milestones such as fundraising points or commercial milestones. Really appreciate being part of this conversation, and I look forward to working with you all in developing medical device innovations. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the overview. I particularly liked your slide where you had the development process, your roadmap, which is going to help companies who are thinking along the same lines. I think that's key, though. And I forgot to thank Sally after her presentation. And working at a large children's hospital and academic medical center, I can certainly appreciate the prioritization you have given to patient and provider experience and how do we address the rise of consumerism, which other service industries have done well, are doing well, and healthcare is a little bit behind. Thanks for doing that. So I have a couple of questions for the panel, and as you can see, this is such a wide spectrum. You have a large children's hospital, startup, medical device, government. Okay, somehow I have to pick a question that all of them can address. I am going to try. And this is something near and dear to my heart, so I'll start with it. Cost or resource allocation. So whether you're working at a hospital, startup, medical device, government, all of what you said requires resource allocation, requires huge resources, people, space, hardware, software, analytics. And I'm sure you have a business plan, but how do you, in 1 minute or less, look at ROI, whether it's financial, whether it's intangible? What's your thought process?
Well, we have the luxury at a large children's hospital to look at things from a return on investment as well as a return on mission. And with the return on mission, we're able to think through how is it advancing not just a sustainability model for one particular item, but also advancing into the flow of clinical care. So it's a pretty dynamic definition of return on investment. We do track investment over time. We build sustainability models to look at not only what we would do at each of the phases of development, but assuming into launch, can we take this out into the market? Can other children's hospitals or other providers participate in it? Additionally, we have the opportunity to link with grants and funding models that tied to philanthropy that help us along the way.
Wonderful, thanks. And I think the return on mission you mentioned, that's it's not a new concept, but a lot of organizations are using that measure to look at where should we put our resources. And in the hospital world, we say no money, no mission, and it also means that no growth, no money, which means if you don't grow, then you don't get to your mission. So, Robert, your thoughts?
So I think in my perspective, my company's perspective, at least initially, we're trying to figure out what the cost of the patient convenience that they're going to get from using our technology would be, to find out how to price appropriately and determine and get the most adoption of the technology.
Makes sense. Thank you. Eric?
So in many of the novel devices that we're involved with, the payment model for those devices, so traditional CPT codes may not be really justifying the investment in the technology. The price of the innovation may be higher than what the CPT what the standard costs are. And so in cases like those, it's important for companies to be looking at secondary costs. So, does introduction of this new innovation, does that avoid, repeat procedures? Does it avoid, additional complexities that may occur down the road? So, we encourage the companies that we work with to think about those secondary costs and to build that into the overall economic model.
Thank you. That's again a great point. When we look at new initiatives, it works both ways. You may have additional what we call downstream revenues from the secondary costs, or in some cases even more downstream expenses. Vasu?
Thanks for letting me do the economics question. Disclosure. FDA does not make decisions based off of economics, so I just want to be clear about that first and foremost. But obviously, I've been in the healthcare sector for quite a while. I've been chief of service for a number of years and a professor at an academic medical center, one of the largest in Texas, for quite a few years before joining the agency. The issues around healthcare utilization and resource utilization is key. It's something that we all have to figure out in terms of creating more value within the system. The areas with respect to that we've been discussing, digital health, AI, ML, have huge potential to make a difference with respect to health resource utilization and adding value to care for patients. That being said, there is that potential also to incur greater costs if we don't steward this process in the most appropriate way. And what I mean by that, we do have plenty of examples outside of the healthcare space where perhaps things didn't go as right as people wanted to. When that happens, especially in a healthcare setting, that not only creates costs directly to the patient, the family, all the physicians, the hospital system, all the people taking care of that patient or that child, but it also creates costs to the potential, meaning the opportunity cost that's lost over time, because there is going to be potentially a great amount of pushback for those technologies, for bringing those technologies forward. And so this is something that I think all of us need to be cognizant of, and I'm sure we are, but just to begin to discuss that we want to take the right steps in the right way that help to advance these technologies that make a difference for patients, but do it appropriately in a stepwise manner.
Actually, I'd like to add a little bit to my answer in your comment there. I think organizations, we have a subsidiary called Integrated Care Solutions that are moving towards value-based care and some of the capitated lives model that allow innovation to be evaluated not just on the individual cost of an item, but also can we get to better outcomes. So building test plans that allow us to look step by step that not only what did it do and its impact in the short term, but if we can look at the benefit to the patient over the course of the year or longer, what can that impact look like? I think one of the big challenges in pediatrics is that many of these preventative medicine care may not show up into adulthood, which is what we saw earlier today. And so how can we identify long-term cost drivers in a shorter-term window and be able to really build that into our economic model?
If we can have one more question to the panel. The product or the work or the slides you showed, that didn't happen overnight. That has taken a while to get to where you are now. Can you point out an inflection point or time frame where you had a big barrier. In your case, it could be buy-in from the providers, things like that. So, and how was that barrier addressed?
That's a good question. I think at a large institution, probably the biggest inflection point at Children's Mercy was about 4 years ago, which was actually before I even joined, was when they decided to invest in an innovation center. And obviously it's an investment in staff, but it's also a philosophical investment to say, as a culture, we're going to invest in the idea of having a long-term vision, as well as resources and barrier removal through different advisory boards and executive support as we go through it. And so just making that strategic choice and saying this is what we're going to get to allows you to then put the framework together to build a roadmap.
Absolutely. It always helps when it's top-down. Robert?
So my answer is going to be from a technology development standpoint. I think like the big barrier that anyone has when they're taking an idea, from just an idea into a product is it even a good idea? Will it even work? And that was kind of where I was. So Wilbur and I had been kicking around the idea, and and the way I overcame the barrier of whether or not you could actually use fingernails to quantify hemoglobin is just by testing on myself. So over the course of a transfusion cycle, like as I get far away from a transfusion, I become more and more anemic. And so I was able to watch my fingernail colors, my fingernail become more pale the farther I got from a transfusion, and then jump back up and become redder right after one. And so that was the proof of concept I needed to take my idea into the clinic at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta to do the clinical studies.
That, if I may say, that sounds risky. Were you actually waiting for your transfusions to be good?
No. Sorry, I wasn't making healthcare decisions based on this idea. No,
Thank
I
you.
was just...
Well, that is dedication.
Yeah. I was
Great.
just tracking.
Thank you. Eric?
I was going to talk a little bit about what I see in terms of the funding being a barrier and a challenge for many of these innovations. So, with the work that we're doing with many of the children's hospitals, there's been growing institutional support. Additionally, there's been FDA's pediatric device grants, which have been really helpful at getting a lot of these innovations kickstarted. But that helps get it to, if you remember my slides, around phase 1, the concept stage. And there's a long way to go to get all the way through V&V and eventually to the market. The funding right now is very challenging for pediatric device companies and medical device companies at large to cross that. However, there's a lot of new initiatives that are taking place, and I'm optimistic that additional funds are going to be rolled out to address this need.
Wonderful. Thanks. Masoom?
So this is a unique question, especially from an FDA perspective. I'll try to address it more from, I think the key inflection point really is a shift in culture. And what I mean by that, and I credit all of my leadership colleagues at the agency, we recognize what is going on with respect to the healthcare space. We want to ensure that we're continuing to make sure that devices that are being approved and cleared by us obviously remain safe and effective, that there is as little inappropriate issues around those devices as possible, that as few things go wrong with them as possible. We've put into place an entire safety action plan to ensure that even on top of what we've already been doing, that we can do even more to ensure that this process is happening. And it really is, again, that culture shift. Obviously, we have to operate according to regulations and statute, but the leadership is trying to create a system of where we're able to be a little bit more nimble. We are continuing to modernize our systems. We are trying to look at what has happened in the past and what has potentially worked in the past and maybe improve on those systems for the current era.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I think we are at time or beyond time, so we'll conclude here. Thanks to our panelists, and as you can see, such a diverse set of experiences and great examples of innovation from various areas in healthcare. Thanks again.